Thank you, Farashuddin sir, BC sir, Pro-BC sir, Treasurer sir, and my colleagues. Actually, I am overwhelmed by seeing the number of participants here. The topic is highly theoretical, and I have assumed that most of the participants have basic knowledge of clustering algorithms. Second, I made the presentation so that the presentation can be finished within 30 minutes as allocated. So many of the terms I will be using here, so the participant may not understand that. So in that case, I will be happy to explain those terms and techniques whenever the floor will be open. So now let's start my presentation. Discovering arbitrarily shaped cluster in high-dimensional numerical data. So clustering may be used in image or other forms like text. So my concentration is with numerical data, because whenever text mining is concerned, then practically the text is converted into numerical data before clustering. Similarly, the images are also, the features of the images becomes numerical, and ultimately those numerical features are used for machine learning or in clustering. Clustering is part of machine learning. So clustering is part of machine learning. Clustering is an unsupervised method of grouping similar data points based on intrinsic structure of the dataset. So there are some words that I need to explain. The first thing is unsupervised. In machine learning, there are two techniques. The one is supervised technique, and most of the machine learning algorithms are supervised, where every data has a label. That means the classes of the data are known. When the classes of the data is not known, then the methods that we use are called unsupervised methods. So we do not have any knowledge about the intrinsic behavior of the data. So two more words are made bold. One is similar data points. So how the similarity is determined among the data points. So I'll be discussing that. And the second one is intrinsic structure of the data set. So I will discuss what is intrinsic structure. And then I will say in very short the limitations of the current methods and the ways of mitigating the current methods, and how can we improve the research gap. So second thing is application of clustering. So first one is the categorization of data points of a data set with no domain knowledge, application of clusters of its own merit. That means we have a data set. We do not know their classes. So we can determine their internal behavior and the classes using unsupervised learning clustering. The second one is very important, though attention is not given in this area. So labeling data points of an unlabeled data set with no ground truth information as pre-processing for supervised machine learning application. So if we have unlabeled data set and we want to use the machine learning algorithms, so machine learning algorithms are supervised algorithms, so label should be known. But we have no domain knowledge, how many clusters are there, how many classes are there, and which data point belongs to which class. So in that case, we can cluster the data points, and each cluster then becomes a class, and then we can use machine learning algorithms. So here I am discussing a figure that shows the application of clustering of its own merit. So here, example, real-life application of clustering. So the domain is chosen to be healthcare area. So say the patient data has many features like lab results, vital signals, and image featuring. So ultimately, it becomes a lot of features. Sometimes it may be hundreds, several hundreds features may be there. So manually or using other technique, the risk analysis of this data of the patient is very difficult. So the data can be clustered to find the risk assessment. So though it is a high dimensional data, means there are lots of, at least more than 20 features. So that is not possible to visualize. We can visualize only 2-dimension and 3-dimension. So we have shown the 2-dimensional projection, and there are some dots, we call it scatter plot, representing the data from the patient. Then if we apply, actually we will apply the clustering algorithms on the whole data with the all dimensions. For easy visualization, we are using a 2-dimensional projection here. So then after clustering, the risk groups are identified, say low risk group, moderate risk, high risk, and the remaining blocks are risk-free. The thing is that here the cluster shapes are irregular, and we call it arbitrarily shaped clusters. So arbitrarily shaped clusters is very difficult in clustering literature, clustering research. The most of the seminal algorithms that have been used for more than 50 years generate the clusters of spherical shape or in 2-dimension circular shape. So many of the information may be distorted, lost, or something may happen that is not correct. So our target is to cluster those data in their own arbitrary shape. So application domains, clustering is used in any area where data is concerned. So geospatial analysis, social network analysis, community detection, very important nowadays, community detection, image processing, bioinformatics, anomaly detection, that is also very important, especially in the financial sector like credit card fraud or other bank transaction, fraud transaction can be identified using the anomaly detection techniques. Robotics and navigation, customer segmentation. If a company has thousands of customers, all customers are not buying the same thing, all customers' choice are not same. So we need to categorize them. Then product categorization almost has similar, which product is good, which is not good, etc., etc. And many other areas. The list will be very big. So what happened? Okay. So in the first slide, I have said the clustering involves two things. One is similarity between data points, and the second thing is the intrinsic structure of the data. So first we are discussing in a high level the similarity measures. So I'm not going to in details. The first one is the LP norms based distance vector space. And the definition is that LP xy, x is a data point, y is a data point. So their distance is calculated like this, x minus y absolute value to the power p, then root of p root of that summation. So two widely used LP norm is L1, Manhattan distance, also known as taxi drive distance. This is widely used in k-means clustering. Then the second one is L2, Euclidean distance, used in k-means hierarchical DB scan, very popular algorithm, optics, sticker. This is my own algorithm published in October 24, etc. So we'll discuss how Euclidean fails in high dimension, though Euclidean matrix is widely used in machine learning, supervised and unsupervised machine learnings. The second one is Mahalanobis distance. Mahalanobis is a Bengali statistician. His grandfather migrated from Bikrampur to Kolkata, though he got his degree in physics but became statistician and number one statistician of India. He established the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata, which is one of the best center of excellence in India, giving hundreds of PhDs, masters, etc., on many areas. So Mahalanobis, Prafulla Chandra Mahalanobis established that institute. So this is a very interesting similarity. You see the LP norm or Euclidean, that is distance between 2 points x and y, but here the distance of y. And that distance is y from the distribution of the data. So the equation is that y is the data, this mu is the global mean of the data set, and C is the covariance matrix, a complicated issue I cannot explain here. And this is also I minus global mean. It takes care of the distribution of the data set. In real data, it appears that in some clusters, the data points are dense And in some clusters, the data points are sparse. So their density are different. So Euclidean cannot handle that type of data. So Mahalanobis distance is useful there. And Mahalanobis is global in need for this Mahalanobis distance. The kernel-induced similarities used in spectral clustering, graph-based distances used in minimum spanning tree-based clustering. So this stick algorithm that I have developed that use spanning tree but not minimum spanning tree. Correlation-based similarity, for example, cosine distance, suitable for high-dimensional sparse continuous data such as X data. And shared nearest neighbor count, suitable for clusters with varying distribution. Now, the intrinsic structure of dataset. So many of the algorithms, seminal algorithms like K-means and Gaussian mixer model, etc., they do not consider the intrinsic behavior of the data. So now the question is, how do we mean by intrinsic behavior? Sorry. The intrinsic structure of a data set referred to the hidden geometry, topological and statistical properties of the data set, which determines the natural organization of the data independent of the ambient space of the data. Ambient space means if my data has, say, 20 or 30 dimensions, then that 30-dimensional space is called the ambient space. So data lives in a high-dimensional ambient space, but the meaningful variation lies on a much lower dimension, intrinsic manifold. That is a subset of the ambient space, and where it is very, very less than this intrinsic diameter is very, very less than intrinsic dimension is very, very less than ambient dimension. So if your data have, say, 20, 30, 50, or sometimes, say, most of the machine learning algorithms generate more than 1,000 features. So that is the ambient dimension. But practically, the behavior of the data that forms manifold, I discussed manifold later, that manifolds are of lesser dimension, and the remaining dimensions are practically noise. A manifold is a shape or surface that may live in a high-dimensional space, but locally it looks like ordinary flat space, like line, plane, etc. Manifolds have two dimensions. Ambient dimension, I have discussed earlier, the space where the manifold lives, dimension of the data set. And intrinsic dimension, the number of the coordinates needed locally by the manifold. So intrinsic structure includes the following latent properties: intrinsic dimensionality, minimal number of independent parameters needed to describe the data. So to describe the data, all features are not always required. Intrinsic geometry, how data points are arranged geometrically on the manifold. We'll see some picture of manifolds later. Intrinsic topology, that means the relative positioning and organization of the manifolds. Topological properties that are preserved under smooth deformations. Intrinsic statistical characteristics, distributional properties along the manifold. Why does intrinsic structure matters in clustering? The answer is clusters are connected components of intrinsic structure. So the data points in a cluster are basically connected to each other. And that connection is determined using the similarity measure. If cluster ignores intrinsic structure, it may fail. Euclidean fails on manifold data. Dimensionality illusion, high ambient dimension masks true cluster separability. And density-based cluster, density values form natural boundaries. For high-dimensional data, intrinsic structure is key to manifold learning. So if we do not learn the structure of the manifold within the data, then clustering will be something wrong. Non-Euclidean distance. Euclidean distance does not work for high-dimensional data. Spectral clustering, diffusion geometry, density-based clustering, and fractional norms. I will discuss fractional norms later on. And in my study, I will consider the fractional norms to overcome some of the problems of high-dimensional data. So here we have picture of two-dimensional manifolds. Say this is a one-dimensional manifold, one-dimensional, 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 two-dimensional, 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 one-dimensional. There is a problem here that this manifold is touching this manifold. So many algorithms will merge these two. However, in this figure, other manifolds are separated from each other, well separated. This is a three-dimensional example. So this is the one-dimensional manifold. This is two-dimensional manifold like a plane. And this is a three-dimensional manifold. So what I said earlier that here the ambient dimension is 3, but the intrinsic dimension of this manifold is 1, and this 2, and this 3. And these data sets is a custom generated data set under my study. I have generated those data. Here are two data sets. The first one is two-dimensional, and the nature of this data set is that intrinsic stress case. Stress case means I'll discuss later, but that will be needed here. So let me say, I said that clusters are connected components. And most of the algorithms use linkage method. So one data point is linked to the other data point for forming clusters depending on the similarity measures. So if the distance between two data points are used, here is a problem that the distances among the data points are smaller than this distance. So if this is stress case, the dimension is stressed, manifold is stressed. So if this distance is used as global threshold, then the distance between these two is smaller than the global threshold, and then these two clusters, red and blue, will be merged together to form a single cluster. And if the global threshold is smaller than this, then possibly this portion will be split from the original cluster. So the data set has some other issues. K-means will never work here. Here, say, if we use K-means, the centroid will be something like here, and this will be merged. And simply these two will be merged. And here, the central will be something here, and these two will be merged. So ultimately, the clustering will be erroneous. The second data set is intrinsic multi-bottleneck. You see, this is a cluster, this is another cluster, but there are multiple weak links between them. So if the global threshold links them, then these two clusters will be merged. So there is a great challenge. How can we handle this? How can we ignore these weak links so that the two clusters are identified separately? And that is my major focus. And this data set also generated under the study. Now, challenges of high-dimensional data clustering. Most of the real data are high-dimensional, so there are lots of challenges. Euclidean metric fails in high-dimensional data. Euclidean dimension does not work in high-dimensional data. The question is why? The first thing is that distance concentration phenomena. In high-dimensional, the data points show some distance concentration. So if we consider the pair-wise distances of all data points, then maximum distance between two pairs minus minimum distance between two pairs divided by minimum distance tends to 0 when dimension tends to infinity. So practically what happens if the dimension is very large, all data seems to be within a very small area in the hyperdimension. Actually, beyond 3 dimensions, we can visualize. The concepts are all mathematical. Dominance of noise dimension. So I said earlier that ambient dimension is higher than the intrinsic dimension of the manifolds. So the remaining dimensions are basically noise. So identifying that noise is very important. So ambient dimension is d, intrinsic dimension small d. So d minus d dimensions are noise. Euclidean distance add noise quadratically. So it is square. Halfness problem, very difficult problem in high dimensional data. A small number of points become halves, appear as nearest neighbor among them. Other points become anti-half, never appears as nearest neighbor. This is not a characteristic of cluster. Cluster cluster does not show this sort of characteristics, but the high dimensional data appears to have this characteristic. So if we can not overcome those problems, then cluster will not be correct. So a side effect of distance geometry is high dimension.
Professor Kong, 5 more minutes, please. 5 more minutes.
Oh. So Euclidean metric fails in high dimensional data. Gaussian assumption fails. Molanovic distance is meaningful for high dimensional Gaussian data. Euclidean distance suffers from increasing covariance. Euclidean distance cannot preserve intrinsic geometry of high dimensional data. Manhattan distance is used for high dimensional data, which cannot completely preserve intrinsic geometry. So properties of high dimensional data, low intrinsic dimensionality, non-uniform local density. Different subset of features create different density pattern, breaks Euclidean assumption, fragmentation and disconnectedness, and ambient dimension increases random data becomes disconnected fragments unless intrinsic structure exists. So the current mitigation strategies, dimensionality reduction before clustering as a pre-processing step. The most common mitigation strategy is to reduce data to a lower dimension before applying Euclidean metrics. Linear methods are principal component analysis, very useful method, and singular value decomposition that considers the variance of the features. And mitigates redundant dimensions and noise accumulation, fails when manifolds are nonlinear, clusters are non-convex, stressed bottlenecks touching clusters exist, variance does not align with the cluster. So dimensionality reduction before clustering, another technique is nonlinear manifolds, UMP TSNE, that is feature extraction method, mitigates manifold structure. Local neighborhoods, intrinsic dimensionality, good for visualization. Limitations are require graph construction in high dimensional, which is costly. Can distort local geometry. TSN UMP are not metric preserving, cannot define clustering boundaries directly, and embedding parameters are sensitive. Then with the dimension reduction, the research gap is that dimension reduction involves intrinsic pre-projection of data to lower dimension, which may distort original geometry. Our proposed method will avoid pre-projection and work directly in the native high-dimensional fractional metric, preserving original geometry without risk of projection distortion. So alternative similarity metrics, like when Euclidean metric fails, alternative metrics are cosine similarity. Because of the time, I'm going fast. Mozammel distance. They all have some drawbacks. And kernel distances using the distribution of the data. Here the research gap uses extrinsic density estimation or global metrics, do not fully mitigate hardness and manifold issues. Fractional LP, where P is greater than 0 but less than 1. Quasi-norm is not studied well for high-dimensional dataset. So we will define and use intrinsic fractional LP quasi-norm, which will reduce hardness, preserve local manifold connectivity, but estimation of P, this P is critical. Another technique is graph-based method. So K nearest neighbor graph clustering, spectral clustering, HDBS scan star, minimum spanning tree clustering. Benefits are uses to local neighborhoods, preserves manifold structure, but weaknesses are case selection is very difficult. Euclidean neighbor graph itself may be unreliable, have distort graph topology. Research gap is here, cannot properly address hardness effect. Parameter case selection is difficult. We will use spanning tree base using the breadth first search tree, clustering using intrinsic fractional LP. Estimation will be automated. So in the previous methods, the value of k is supplied by the user. Our target is that this k will be estimated within the algorithm. Density-based adaptation. DBscan fails in high dimension due to flattening of density. Alternatives are is DBscan star optics dentlu shared nearest neighbor. That is also our target. Our approach will avoid density estimation. We will incorporate shared nearest neighbor, intrinsic fractional LP, and the hybrid. So research graphs existing approaches treat high dimensional data extrinsically through projection. Projection means high dimensional data is projected into low dimensional so that it can be manageable. Or global metrics, our approach will treat high dimensional data intrinsically by reconstructing local fractional neighborhoods, suppressing halfness, and preserving manifold connectivity. So this is the proposed approach. So we will use the similarity measure, this shared nearest neighbor, or intrinsic fractional LP, or the hybrid. So here I am showing how the breadth first search will identify the clusters from the data. Say, for example, we start from this node. The node are numbered according to the discovery pattern of the breadth first search. Right? Then this breadth first search will explore this 2 and 3. Then 3 will identify 4, 2 will identify 5 and 6, 5 will identify 9, 6 will identify 7 and 8. This is the discovery process of breadth first search. And after that, it will never find or never discover the data points of this area, because the threshold is defined in the algorithm. So this will constitute a cluster, and similarly that will constitute another cluster. So this is proposed research methodology pipeline. Research design, the fonts are small. Parameterless clustering framework. Almost all existing clustering algorithms use user-defined parameters, and that is very difficult to estimate. So our approach will automatically calculate those parameters from the intrinsic behavior of the data. Arbitrarily shaped high-dimensional data, real clusters are actually arbitrarily shaped. Fractional LP distance or SSN similarity we use. Spanning tree clustering approach. The data sources we will use synthetic datasets, custom designed controlled shapes dimension. I have shown 4 datasets that I have already generated. Synthetic dataset from repository like GitHub. GitHub has lots of synthetic dataset. And real world dataset. Actually, I have to validate my approach using real life data. Real life data are found in UCI, University of California, Irvine's repository, Kaggle, etc. There are lots of repositories. Supports comparative evaluation. Dataset selection. So dataset will be selected so that structural variation and intrinsic dimensionality are there of various shape and number. Computational resource consideration. So computational resource is very important. So if the number of data is n, then in almost all clustering algorithm, existing clustering algorithm requires n square d time. So huge time. So we have to reduce the computational time. Evaluation, suitability, and benchmarking coverage. The algorithm development will work here. Fractional LP similarity, SSN similarity, parameter estimation, spanning tree construction, C language implementation and optimization, performance analysis, external performance is accuracy, adjusted RAND index, and normalized mutual information, F1. Internal cluster validation, SLOT, and this SLDT, internal validation metric, is developed by me and published in October 25. Scalability, size, dimensional noise, visualization, etc., etc. Deliverable of the study. Open source C implementation. C implementation will be made open for all. Benchmark dataset and reports. So we'll be trying to develop some benchmark dataset. Reproducibility artifacts. So all information will be made public so that the experimental result that I have been reporting, other researchers can completely reproduce that. And publication, obviously Q1 targeted. So conclusion, existing algorithms for high dimensional numerical data clustering have several limitations. Oh, it's not working. We will study effect of intrinsic fractional LP, SSN, and hybrid based on breadth-first search tree for clustering high dimensional numerical data. This is completely a fundamental resource. Theory development, implementation, testing, and validation. Not an applied research targeted to any specific application area. However, this method can be used in any application area having numerical features. So that's all about my presentation. Thank you for listening.